I love it when the Pharisees always try to trap Jesus and they try to kind of catch him. I kind of smile inside thinking, these guys really just aren't that smart. It's like, have you ever argued with God? That's kind of what's going on here. They're just kind of like trying to trick him, trying to catch him. And so, we've titled our time, When God Breaks His Silence, and then we have that catch line. What we're going to see is that when God broke his silence here, he's going to bring clarity to us. But he's going to bring clarity amid the controversy. And I think to myself, man, isn't that what we need today? Clarity amid controversy. Now, 30 years ago, you probably heard this term, evangelism. And evangelism was what you would do to share your faith, right? And, people would go do evangelism, and we do evangelistic outreaches. And evangelism was the term of how we would reach out. About 15 years ago, that term changed. Meaning the same thing, but you probably heard the term, we need to be missional. We need to live as missionaries in the world we live in. And so we need to engage culture as missionaries by bringing the gospel. It was pretty much the same thing as evangelism. They just called it something different. Well, in one of the books I was reading, that term changed. So no longer are they calling it evangelism. No longer are they calling it missional anymore. Now what they're calling it is, we need to be gospeling. I think it's kind of funny, but it's kind of cool. It's kind of got a cool ring to it, don't you think? We're gospeling. We're bringing the good news. Well, here's the bottom line. All three are trying to accomplish the same thing, yet what happens is each group debates with the other group about the methods of what they're trying to accomplish. The goal is the same, but we debate over the methods. And so I'll tell you this, call it what you want. Sharing the gospel, the good news, with a lost and dying world is still important. So whether you want to call it your evangelizing, your missional, your gospeling, I don't care. What I want you to do is share the good news. Tell people about Jesus. Bring them into your house. Invite them to dinner. Sit them at your table. Love on them with the love that Jesus lavished upon you. But the question is, what keeps us from sharing the gospel? And I would say that probably the primary thing that keeps us from sharing the good news is fear. Fear paralyzes us. Well, in Matthew chapter 19, what we're going to see is the Pharisees are going to, again, try to trap Jesus as they question him on marriage and divorce. Now, this may be one of those sermons that you're like, oh no, it makes me uncomfortable because I don't like to talk about that. And if so, I'm sorry, but it's in the Bible and therefore we need to talk about it. I'm not going to pass it up just because it makes us feel uncomfortable, because the truth of the matter is this: we've all been impacted by marriage and divorce. I know it's part of my story, and I know it's a part of a lot of people's story. Statistics will say that 50% of marriages end in divorce. 50%. And some people will argue, well, it's got to be different in the church, but you know what? It still says it's the same. But do you know what happens at this point? We now begin to argue over how did you come to that statistic? They'd be like, well, it's actually lower in the church because, you got to count those that are devout Christians opposed to those that aren't devout Christians. And we're trying to make it sound like we're better in the church, when in reality, divorce has really impacted the church as well. And so the bottom line is we all have to deal with the ramifications of it. So how do we do that? And what we're going to see today is how Jesus is going to bring clarity and hope as he answers their question. And he's calling us to this. He's calling us to be evangelical missionaries who are gospeling. I combined them all together. That's how you make it all work. We're evangelical missionaries who are gospeling. That's who we are. So let's look at what that looks like. In the first 3 verses, what we're going to see is Jesus is going to clarify the question that's being asked. So check this out. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And a great multitude followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And then I picture them standing back, crossing their arms, and, "All right, buddy, answer it. Answer the question." Because they knew that it was a controversial question. They knew that what they were going to do is rile up at least 50% of the population. You see, here's what's interesting, is that they tested Jesus. And what we need to understand this is if the religious leaders of the day were going to test Jesus, that you could be assured that you will also be tested when it comes to your faith. Jesus himself said a servant isn't above his master, Matthew 10:24. So if Jesus was tested, we can expect to be tested as well. But to understand this question better, we must understand what was going on in that day. We need to understand the culture. For that time, divorce was a very hot topic. It was like the hot topic of the day, making divorce and remarriage a very controversial discussion. So picture that. They show up with a very controversial question. And they want to stir the pot. The reason it was controversial is because there were 2 thoughts that were out there that were supported by 2 different rabbis. You had Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. Okay? And in a second, I'll tell you what their stances were. But what they did is they debated over and they divided over Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, which says this: "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." Now you could listen to that and you can think, I can see why that's a very hot topic back in the day. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense at first. You're looking at it like, so she can be divorced and she can remarry, but if this guy dies, she can't marry the first guy, and they're all trying to figure it out. And so here's what these 2 prominent rabbis came up with. Rabbi Hillel interpreted Deuteronomy 24 to mean this: that a man could divorce his wife for any reason. So let's just say she wakes up in the morning, gets up early, gets ready, starts preparing breakfast, and she burns a falafel. He could divorce her for a burnt falafel. Now, burnt falafels may be bad, but they're not divorce worthy. The bottom line was he was looking for a reason to get out and was going to look for any opportunity to get there. But the other guy, Rabbi Shammai, held to a stricter interpretation that marriage could only be broken by adultery. And so the debate concerning divorce and remarriage got heated. People were fighting over it and dividing over it. And so here come the Pharisees with this question to Jesus, thinking, I'm sure in their head, if we can get Jesus to commit to one side, he's going to tick off 50% of the population and we win. They're going to want to kill him. They're going to want his head. And so in reality, the Pharisees were coming not not to trap Jesus, but to divide the people. It's kind of sad, don't you think? See, they were using a hot topic to bring division. I would say that today our hot topic isn't so much divorce as it is marriage. So, to bring clarity, I want to point out what's really lost here. You see, they were so caught up in the divorce, and I think sometimes we're so caught up over marriage that we lose, really, I think, the most important part of this passage. And I get why they did it, because you have to, for them, they wouldn't have understood it, but for us being able to look back, we get it. Where's Jesus headed? He left where he was on his way to Jerusalem where he would die. So he's on his path, he's on the journey to pick up the cross, to deal with the sins that separate a world from a God that loves them. He's on his way to the cross to demonstrate the love of God. It's the gospel that's lost in their debate. It was the fact that Jesus was willing to go and die for us when we were at our worst. Isn't that what Paul told us in Romans 5:8? But God demonstrated his own love towards us, and while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When we were at our worst, Christ died for us. And so regarding the hot topics of today, whatever they might be, we must filter our response through the love of Jesus, through the gospel of Jesus that says when we're at our worst, God is at his best in demonstrating his love towards us. So the better question here is not whether is it lawful, but what is Jesus doing in light of the hot topics? And what if we were to ask that question today? Is it lawful for these things to happen? Or what is God doing in our world today? How is he showing us the gospel? And how can we become evangelical missionaries that are gospeling? How can we bring the gospel to our society? And here's what I'm finding. I'm finding that the true questions that need to be asked are somewhere behind the questions that are being asked the loudest. Meaning we hear these loud questions being asked, but the true questions that people are really wanting answers to are behind that. And they're hiding behind hot topics, hoping that we'll ask the right question. The second thing that we're going to see in verses 4 through 6 is that Jesus clarifies marriage. And this is important. This is very important. Verse 4, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And what I love about Jesus is this. Before he addresses the divorce question, what does he do? He clarifies marriage. He clarifies marriage. You see, Jesus went beyond the rabbis and the law, and he reminded the people that marriage was established in Eden upon creation. And he goes on to say that God's the one that instituted marriage in Eden long before the Mosaic law was given. Now, we know that the Bible gives at least 3 reasons, and we could probably find multiple more reasons as to why marriage was given, but I'm just going to use these 3. But 3 reasons why marriage was established for us. Number 1, to continue the race. Be fruitful and multiply. Have lots of babies. Populate the world. Not a bad thing, right? That's what they were to do. But marriage was for companionship and enjoyment. Genesis 2:18. You're to enjoy your wife. You're to enjoy each other. You're supposed to have fun just sitting and looking at each other, doing nothing. I recommend that. I'm 50. I recommend that. Do it. Sit there and look at nothing. Do nothing. Just look at each other. But it also, most importantly, according to Ephesians 5, God instituted marriage because it shows us the type of relationship that God wants to have between him and his church. And there's a supernatural aspect of it. And so God's plan for marriage is one man to be wed to one woman for one lifetime, where only death would break that union. That's God's design. So it's more than physical union. It's a union of the hearts and the minds. We're told it's stronger than family ties, right? A man was to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. It's a sacred union. It's a union between Jesus, our bridegroom, and us, the bride, the church of Christ. Now, today the majority doesn't hold to a biblical worldview when it comes to marriage, does it? And we can look about that and we can get all worked up. But yet, here's the kind of crazy thing to me. What is the badge of honor that our nation holds to? Well, we're a Christian nation. Really? I would say we're a Christian nation only when it's convenient. That's going to be my stance. Now, I may have offended you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Well, maybe I did a little bit. But that's just how it is. Only when it's convenient are we this Christian nation. But here's what I'm finding. I've heard this statement, and I've been holding on to it lately, and that is clarity is kindness. And here's what I mean. Oftentimes, I think what happens is we, in our evangelism, missional living, gospeling endeavor, we kind of try to bait and switch people. Like, hey, come here, let me tell you, you're all, and then we pull the rug out, and this is what we believe. So I think we need to be clear right off the get-go. Where do we stand as a church when it comes to marriage? We stand on the biblical view of marriage, as we just read right here. One man, one woman, one lifetime, where only death should separate it. Period. Now, that being said, there's going to be people that disagree with us, right? People are going to disagree with that. But if clarity is kindness, and we're communicating this with the intent that we can, like our desire is to make Jesus famous as we love every heart, that means that anybody could come, even if they disagree with our stance on biblical marriage. They're welcome to come into the building and sit down and fellowship with us. And we will love every heart that comes through the door. But what we must never do is make people feel like projects when they come in the door. That they're a project to be completed rather than a person to be loved. And yes, we are committed to believing a biblical marriage, but we're also committed to walking through life with people that see things differently than we do. Loving them as Christ loved us. We want them to know that we are willing to love them even if we disagree. You see, we need to be a safe place where people could come and disagree with us. And I will tell you this, I've had some of the best conversations with the people I've disagreed with the most. I really have. So we need to be clear. And I believe it's been pretty clear where we stand. I don't think anybody can say, well, I don't know what you believe. Well, I just said it twice to emphasize it. But to be clear a third time, we believe marriage is between one man, one woman, as instituted by God in Genesis chapter 2. But to also be very clear, this doesn't mean we hate those that we disagree with. They have to go hand in hand. To be very clear, We are committed to taking a loving posture, and we are willing to have honest, intelligent, and loving conversations with those who we disagree with. I'm going to repeat that. We are committed to have honest, intelligent, and loving conversations to those we disagree with. And we have to have all three of those in order to have a good, productive conversation. But finally, what we need to understand is this. When it comes to marriage, marriage is actually an act of faith. And one of the things I tell people that I perform their weddings as I sit down with them for pre-marriage counseling is this, is you need to believe that if God brought you together, he's going to keep you together. It's going to take faith. And there's one aspect I really love about pre-marriage counseling, and you guys can attest to this. So that's my latest wedding right there. Wave. I had them look at each other. And they were looking at each other. They're, oh, it's so cute. And I said, I want you to know you're looking at the biggest threat to your marriage. And simultaneously they looked at me like, you're a jerk. But I always ask this question, why are you getting married? They passed it right off the bat. Not many couples do that. Usually I get we just love each other so much. And I'm sitting there trying to make myself vomit. I'm like, really? That's not going to work. And I tell them, I said, and I put the pressure on them. I said, well, if you don't get the answer right, I'm just not going to do your wedding. And they're like, oh. I've done over 80 weddings, so I haven't turned anyone down because we get to the, after we get through the usually lovey-dovey, warm and fuzzy ones. But I get to them, I'm like, here's the deal. I said, you need to be able to tell me and back it up by Scripture how you know that God brought you together. Because eventually marriage is going to get difficult, and you're going to look at each other, and you're not going to necessarily love each other like you're loving each other right now with this awe and where everything's puppies and butterflies, It's going to be tough. You're going to wake up to bad breath and bad hair, and you're going to smell smells you've never smelled before. And it just, yeah. But I tell them this. I said, here's the bottom line. I said, if you know that God brought you together and you bring faith in the middle of your relationship, what you're saying is that I believe regardless of what we're going through at any given moment, God brought us together, and that's the foundation, and we can build upon that. And who God brought together, we're not going to let any man separate. Amen. So marriage takes faith, and here's what we're committed to. We're committed to strengthening your faith through the teaching of God's Word, because it's the Word of God that stirs up our faith. And you can ask anybody that I've done their wedding. I always tell them this. I am committed to you for the rest of your life, or at least the rest of my life, because I can't be for you if you're still alive and I'm dead. But if you have issues, my door's open. And we've had many people that have come back and said, hey, we're really struggling with this, or how can we do that? And it's an honor to be a part of somebody's special day. But the other thing I always bring up is that, the world tells you it's all about day one, right? Everybody spends all kinds of money on day one, and I'll tell them, I said, here's what's going to happen on day one. She's going to get all dressed up in white, and the doors are going to open, and you're going to clean yourself up and put yourself in a suit and stand there, and she's going to be like, who is that guy? I haven't seen him before. And then she's going to parade herself down the aisle as a sinless creature, which she's not. And they look at me like, you're a jerk. And I said, you're going to do all this, and then you wake up the next morning and it's not what it was. And that's just day one. I said, we need to look 60, 70 years down the road. How do we get there? Well, you get there by saying, you know what? We entered a covenantal relationship between God and each other that says we're going to trust God to keep us together through the hard things in life. And Jesus brought clarity to that. He defined marriage, and he tells us how marriage stays together and keeps it strong. But now what he's going to show us in verses 7 through 9 is that clarity leads to protection. And it says, then they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for the sexually immoral and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So the Pharisees asked, if the union is to remain as long as they both shall live, why does the Old Testament offer the divorce option? That's pretty much what they're asking. And Jesus says, well, here's the real issue, guys. Your hearts are hardened. That's what he says. The issue is your heart. You see, the heart of the matter is that we are always trying to find a loophole to get out of what God has commanded. Have you ever noticed that? I know it's not just what God's commanded, it's everything. Like if somebody tells me do something this way, I'm always trying to find the easier way to do it. And you know what I found? I've wasted so much time trying to do it the easy way that if I just did it the way they asked me to do it, it would have been done long before it got done. You see, it's not about the easy way, because I'm going to be honest with you, there's no easy way about marriage. One of the other things I will tell them in my pre-marriage is it's like a battle, right? You got the groom and his family of warriors, and you got the bride and her family. And when they come together, it's like these two armies coming to clash. Like, is it really that bad? I said, sometimes it's not that bad. Sometimes it's really kind of cool. I like the pick a seat, not a side signs that you see at some weddings, because a lot of people want to pick sides. But they just take a seat, intermingle. But the heart of the matter here was that they had hard hearts. You see, here's what the Pharisees were trying to do. They were trying to show that Jesus and Moses were in conflict with each other. Two people, well, one person anyway, that the Jews thought very highly of was Moses. The Jews didn't really like Jesus. Most of them still don't. But they were trying to show everybody, hey, they don't get along. This is why we got to throw this guy out. Think about it this way. People will say, well, the Bible's an old document. It's an old book. It's flawed. It's full of mistakes. And you want to know how you answer that? You're right. It is full of mistakes. David made a mistake with Bathsheba. Peter made a mistake denying Christ. Yes, it's full of people that have made mistakes, but the Bible is not a flawed document. We got to remember why Moses gave this law and what the law really stated. Moses didn't command divorce for this. He permitted it. God permitted it because their hearts were hard. Moses didn't command that the divorced woman, or Moses did command that the divorced woman was given a bill of divorce. Why? To protect her. He was protecting her. Did you know that really, if somebody was caught in the act of adultery, divorce wasn't the outcome, stoning was? Death. They would kill you. That's why when Jesus was brought that woman caught in the act of adultery, they're like, hey, pick up your stones, let's go. And when he didn't, it really threw him for a loop. Jesus was protecting this woman to make it more difficult for the man to divorce her in the heat of anger. You see, the woman was forbidden to return to her first husband, but she could marry another man. This divorce law was a temporary thing for Israel. This was given to the Israelites. And so what Moses is doing through God's revelation is giving us prescribed boundaries as to how divorce was allowed and permitted, but not encouraged. He wasn't encouraging this. Really, I mean, go back to what we said. If marriage takes faith, what you got to trust is this. Regardless of what goes on in the marriage relationship, God can overcome that. Again, according to the Old Testament law, the penalty for adultery was not divorce, but death. But here's the hope that we have. John 1:17. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. So I don't believe a person whose marriage failed lives in a continual state of adultery if they get married a second time. If that was the case, God would not bless Solomon. I mean, we see it in the Old Testament that there was blessings after divorce. And here's what I know. I know that I am a bride. And I also know that I have failed greatly. But what I do know is that my bridegroom, Jesus, is willing to protect me. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Protecting his bride. How did he do that? By absorbing my sins, by his love, and by bringing me into his family. Guys, that's still good news today. That's still good news. And then finally, what we're going to see is that Jesus clarifies the real problem in verses 10 through 15. It says, his disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Then little children were brought to him, that he might put his hand on them and pray. But the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for such is the kingdom of heaven. And he laid his hands on them and departed from there. And so Jesus now brings clarity to the real problem. And here's what I think the real problem is. We have made marriage an idol. We've elevated marriage to this place where it has surpassed Jesus. I remember growing up in youth group, it was like, hey, you can't do anything, then you get married and then make up for lost time. That's what we were told. You know? And yet what that does to a 16-year-old guy is like, hey, here, marriage is the pinnacle. That's it. 30 years into marriage, it's not all that they told me it was. Nobody ever told me it was going to be tough. Nobody ever told me it was going to be difficult. Nobody ever told me I was the problem. All right? No, everybody said, you do this and it's going to be great. But I want to suggest something. Maybe there would be less divorce, especially in the church if we stopped idolizing marriage and gave value to singleness. Because Jesus says here, not all of you are going to be married. Think about it. Jesus was single. Paul was single. But when marriage becomes our idol, then even those who were called to singleness feel like they have to get married or they're less than a person. But what if we elevated singleness to the place equal to marriage? It says, hey, they're both okay. It's okay to get married. It's okay to stay single. And what if the church spent more time creating a space where single than married people could become a family? Where the single people don't feel like they're losing out because they're not married. And the married people realize that there's some people that are called to be single, and it doesn't make sense. One of my best friends, he's been single ever since I've known him. And we've done ministry all over the world together, and he's still single. And he loves the Lord, and he walks faithfully with the Lord. But you know what? We were able to bring him into our family. My kids loved him. Thought he was a bit different, but they loved him. And I love Scott. And to this day, he's now in Mississippi. We talk every so often. But it's not like it used to be. But when we talk, it's like we've never missed a beat. We need to create a place where marriage isn't the end. And that marriage isn't the top, but Jesus is. We need to put Jesus back into his rightful place on the top. He needs to be on the top of the pyramid, not marriage. And we need to be okay with him and pointing people to him. Truth of the matter, some of you shouldn't get married. You just shouldn't. That's not what God's called you to. But most of you are. And so here's the deal. You need to trust God that he's going to keep you together. Even when he wakes up and smells funny. Or 20 years down the road when he's gained a little bit of weight. Or a lot. Why are you laughing? So if you're given the grace and the calling to remain single, rejoice in that. Because there's great freedom. You can do things that married people can't. It's difficult sometimes to sync two calendars. And then when you have kids, it's even more difficult. But if you're single, if you're called to single, be like, or if you're not single, if you're called to be married, be like Philip and raise godly children. Guide them and direct them. Pour into their lives. And if you failed in the past, don't throw in the towel. Don't give up. Know this, that God has a redemptive plan for your future. God has a redemptive plan for your future. And I don't think it's coincidence that this section ends by Jesus calling the little children to him. You see, right after dealing with the hot topic of the day, Jesus turns his attention to the children. Why? Because it's the kids who are always directly affected by the divorce. And here's what I don't think. I don't think Jesus' main point was to get our theology correct, though that's important. We have to have proper theology. I believe that what Jesus intended to get across this day was what we need to do is we need to get love right while dealing with our theology. And what I mean is this, we need to get our love with God right. We need to put Jesus in his rightful place in our life. And we need to love him first and foremost. And then everything else from there will fall in place where it needs to be. And so today, we're going to navigate all kinds of hot topics like marriage and divorce, and you've got your list. There's so many of them out there. But let's ask Jesus for the grace to get love right, to put him where he needs to be. Because here's what I'm finding, is that everybody in the world has been impacted by marriage and divorce. And everybody that I've talked to that has been impacted, they're hoping that we get love right and that we're willing to show and be the good news that says the gospel is the fact that God has redemption in your future. That's what they're hoping for. They're hoping that we will show them what we believe is God's design. Because somewhere, some way, they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's plan is always the right plan to protect their lives. And people are looking to be protected, and people are looking to be loved. And God has called us to be the evangelical missionaries that are gospeling to let a world know that God still has redemption for their future.